The teaching about 1914 was first calculated by Nelson H. Barber, an independent Adventist. In the year 1870s, he published this in his magazine Herald of the Morning. Charles Taze Russell discovered Barber's magazine in 1876, adopted the 1914 calculation, and popularized it extensively through the early Bible students movement. Barber's 1914 is derived from John Aquila Brown's 2,520 years calculation of Daniel chapter 4, verse 16's 7 times. Barber pointed 1914 as the end of this period. He believed that following the expiration of that Gentile times, God's kingdom would reappear on earth and human governments would come to an end. Nelson H. Barber died on 1905. When 1914 arrived, no kingdom of God appeared, and the governments of the nations still remained. But there is a great war that broke out that year. Because of this, Charles Taze Russell and his co-believers of Nelson Barber's 1914 altered the teaching, stating that the kingdom did indeed appear in 1914, but in heaven rather than on earth. This belief continues to be held by the leaders of the sect that identified themselves back in 1931 as Jehovah's Witnesses. In 2004, this belief was dismantled by Christ through Sonny Cristiano. In a letter he sent to the JW governing body that year, he corrected their false assumption about restoration of God's kingdom in 1914. He told them the 7 times was pointing to Israel's restoration in 1948. 7 multiplied 365 equals 2555 minus 607 equals 1948. Sadly, the new light was rejected by the JW governing body, and that is understandable because without 1914, they would lose their claim to being God's one and only channel of communication on earth. Why? Because back in 1927, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, founder of the so-called Jehovah's Witnesses and successor to Charles Taze Russell, fabricated the teaching that in 1919 Christ appointed them as the faithful and discreet slave, a title mentioned in Luke 12:42. Recall that before 1914 their belief was that upon the arrival of that year the kingdom of God would be restored on earth. When this failed to happen, they changed this teaching, moving from claims that it would be restored on earth to claims that the kingdom did indeed appear in 1914 but in heaven. They speculated that in that year, Christ became king and inspected Christian religions, and that in 1919 Christ appointed the leaders of the Watchtower Society as his one and only faithful and discreet slave on earth. Thus, 1914 became the basis for the legitimacy of their authority. Source:
The Watchtower Study Edition, February 3, 2017, article title, Who is Leading God's People Today? Page number 26, paragraph 10.
In 2012, they narrowed the title Faithful and Discreet Slave down strictly to the governing body to exclude all others from having a share in that title. Source:
The Watchtower Study Edition, July 15, 2013, article title, Who Really is the Faithful and Discreet Slave? Page number 20, paragraph 10.
So, obviously, the leadership of the so-called Jehovah's Witnesses holds tightly to Nelson Barber's 1914 speculation, despite the unassailable evidence of the prophetic 7 times fulfillment, pointing to Israel's restoration in 1948. Because without 1914, the governing bodies claimed that Christ appointed them as the faithful and discreet slave in 1919 would crumble. 1914 fake news. In the book You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, published by the Jehovah's Witnesses, pages 140-141, the JW explained that Jesus returned invisibly in 1914 and began ruling as King of God's kingdom in heaven. They based this belief on a chronological calculation derived from Daniel chapter 4, where the 7 times is interpreted to represent 2,520 years measured from the destruction of Jerusalem in 607 BCE to 1914 CE. Because of their belief that God's kingdom began reigning in heaven in 1914, their leadership exhorted them to pray also for the kingdom of God to come to the earth, quoting Matthew 6:10, "Let your kingdom come on earth." However, from that same verse, they ignore the subsequent line, "as it is in heaven," as well as the fact that these words were uttered by Christ around 30 AD. These points alone are enough for a person with common sense to realize that the kingdom of God was already established or had arrived in heaven back when the Son descended to earth to do the will of his Father. The kingdom of God was present and already established in heaven while Jesus was on earth. And Jesus wanted people to pray for that kingdom to come to earth also, as it is in heaven. In short, the kingdom of God was established in heaven around 30 AD, not 1914. When did Jesus become king? The Jehovah's Witnesses' answer is 1914, which is incorrect. The truth is, before the Son of God ascended back to heaven after completing his mission, he said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," indicating he had obtained the seal to rule as king, Matthew 28:18. However, his coronation did not happen right after his return. The Son had to wait first. When he returned to heaven, the Almighty Father told him, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." Acts 2:34-36, 7:55-56. Christ had to wait first until 70 AD, when Jerusalem fell, before he fully received his kingship. Luke 19:27. Jesus hinted that in the year 70, Satan had fallen from heaven. When the Lord sent out the 70 disciples, Luke 10:1, he foresaw Satan falling from heaven following that event, Luke 10:18. In short, the arrival of God's kingdom, around 30 AD, and the enthronement of Christ as king in heaven and earth, 70 AD, occurred long ago, not in 1914. The Jehovah's Witness belief regarding 1914 is rooted in a misapplied interpretation of the prophetic tree in Daniel 4. This interpretation is flawed because Daniel had already explained what the tree meant. According to the Jehovah's Witnesses, the tree supposedly represents the kingdom of God, and the 7 times represent its disappearance from the earth and its subsequent reappearance in heaven after that period. However, Daniel explicitly stated that the tree refers to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 4:22, and the 7 times refer to the loss of his sanity and its eventual return, Daniel 4:25. Nothing more. There are no biblical hints that it conveys a greater secondary fulfillment. The insistence that Christ's kingdom was established in heaven in 1914 is simply a product of pride, meant to save face from the embarrassment of its early promoters. Because in that year, 1914, what Charles Taze Russell and his associates expected, to be taken up to heaven, did not happen. Source, Jehovah's Witnesses, Proclaimers of God's Kingdom, pages 62-133. This failed prediction became the basis for them being labeled as false prophets. The true 7 times culminating in 1948. Yes, there are 7 times set by God against Israel should they forsake him. Read Leviticus 26:18, 21, 24, 28. But its fulfillment has nothing to do with the 1914 speculation. Rather, it relates to Sonny Cristiano's 1948 revelation from Christ. 7 times 365 equals 2,555 minus 607 equals 1948. What evidently and undeniably happened in 1948 was God's restoration of Israel, fulfilling his promise to them written in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 19-24 and 32-36, because, as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Romans chapter 11, verse 28-29, Leviticus chapter 26, verse 42-45. In that same year, Christ began repairing the subjects of his kingdom who had been divided by Satan. Read Ephesians 1:10.
A plan for the fullness of time, to unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth.
This work can be seen in the establishment of the World Council of Churches in 1948, an organization meant to unite Christians across different denominations globally, though it has not achieved its goal. From 2004 to 2012, Sonny Cristiano made it known to all sects of the Christian religion that Christ had set a 70-year timeline from 1948 to 2018 to end divisions, urging all Christians to love one another instead of continuing to participate in or live by the greedy system of the world. He made this known even to the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses, stating that in the years 2018-2019, God would begin to bring destruction in order to enforce his rule on earth. Consequently, a widespread global standstill occurred from the 2019 COVID-19 outbreak until 2022 due to lockdowns. As the pandemic weakened, war broke out in Europe, which continues to this day. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 24-25. The 1914 doctrine did not originate from Charles Taze Russell's Bible Students movement, and even less so from the sect Jehovah's Witnesses, founded by Joseph Franklin Rutherford. They merely borrowed it from Nelson Barber. What originally came from the line of Bible students was the teaching concerning 1948, which was discovered by Sonny Cristiano, a former member of the JW sect, but identified himself as a Bible student for studying the Bible independently. He eventually left the JW sect after learning the whole truth. His belief that this knowledge was destined to be revealed within the line of the Bible students was strengthened even further when he learned that Charles Taze Russell was actually a Christian Zionist, a Christian who supported the re-establishment of the nation of Israel. Charles Taze Russell was a Christian Zionist ahead of his time. He was not a member of the sect Jehovah's Witnesses, nor was he its founder. The JW religious organization was founded by Joseph Franklin Rutherford in 1931. What was founded by Russell was a study group known as the Bible Students Movement in the year 1872 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. In 1879, Charles Taze Russell began publishing Zion's Watchtower magazine. In 1881, he created Zion's Watchtower Tract Society. They used the term Tract Society because the Bible students' primary purpose was to print and distribute tracts containing what they learned from studying the Bible. A Christian Zionist. Years before the famous Jew Theodor Herzl proposed creating a Jewish state, Charles Taze Russell was already traveling frequently across Europe and America to deliver lectures directly to large Jewish audiences, urging them to return to their ancient homeland and restore their nation. In 1891, Russell went as far as writing personal letters to prominent figures like billionaire Edmund de Rothschild to pitch concrete plans for the Jewish colonization and settlement of the so-called Palestine. On Sunday, October 9, 1910, Charles Taze Russell delivered a famous public speech to an estimated 4,000 Jewish audience in the New York Hippodrome to encourage them to return to their homeland and restore their nation. His discourse was titled Zionism in Prophecy. Unlike most Christian ministers of his time, Russell did not pressure his Jewish listeners to convert to Christianity. He believed that Jews did not need to become Christians to return to their homeland. Instead, he urged them to remember God's ancient promise to Abraham and to align themselves with its fulfillment. He used the Old Testament to argue that the period of Jewish subjugation and wandering was biblically coming to an end, that God was about to restore the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. Russell taught that the Jewish people would inherit the earthly promises of God's kingdom, acting as a global blessing to mankind. Russell held these Zionist beliefs firmly until his death in 1916. The reversal of Joseph Franklin Rutherford. After Russell's death, Rutherford assumed control of the Bible Students movement. He introduced significant changes, leading to a split in the movement. In July 1931, Rutherford proposed the name Jehovah's Witnesses to distinguish his followers from breakaway Bible students. He completely abandoned Russell's Zionist beliefs, and from that point forward, the Watchtower Society taught that biblical prophecies about Israel applied spiritually to Jehovah's Witnesses rather than to literal modern-day Jews. In 2004, Sonny Cristiano, a then member of the JW organization, sent letters to the governing body several times until 2015. The letters explained the prophecy of Israel's restoration in 1948, the ensuing 70-year countdown ending in 2018, and the needed preparation. The letters were dismissed, and the sender was advised to avoid such teachings, implying that they came from mentally diseased apostates. Jesus Christ to Sonny Cristiano.
I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews but are a synagogue of Satan. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews though they are not, but are liars. I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you.